Welcome everybody. I think we're all here, or most of us are here in any case. So welcome to the first lecture of 2025, which is our third year, I think, of the Military History Club. I hope some of you will remember Lord Sumption's podcast that we did, which was beginning of last year, and anyway, a fair while ago, and that was timed to coincide with the publication of his fifth and final volume of majestic survey of the 100 Years' War, which I think is 43 years in the making. Meanwhile, of course, Lord Sumption's had a rather pressing day job as both a barrister and a judge, with a stint on the Supreme Court. But nevertheless, he's produced one, as I think you'll all agree, one of the finest pieces of historical work over the last 20 or 30 years, now complete, so feel free to ask him what next, maybe nothing. But tonight he's going to talk about the 100 Years' War more generally, but also, I think, homing in a little bit on Volume 5. Lord Sumption.
Well, 43 years, yes. Why write about the 100 Years' War? Why read about it? Why does it matter? Well, after 43 years, I think I can offer at least a partial answer to those questions. War and religion have been the two main collective activities of mankind for most of its history. This particular succession of destructive wars, separated by tense intervals of peace and dishonest and impermanent treaties, is one of the central events of European history. Writing some 40 years after the wars had ended, the French politician and diplomat Philippe de Commines had a simple and, you might think, cynical explanation of the wars. God, he said, never created man or beast in the world without creating his opposite to keep him on his toes and prevent him from getting above himself. Thus, to the English, to the Kingdom of France, he has given the English, and to the English, he has given the Scots. In reality, the 100 Years' War was far larger than just England, France, and Scotland. In the 14th and 15th centuries, it was Europe's major international conflict. It drew in the whole of Western Europe, Castile, Portugal, Italy, Germany, Switzerland, the Low Countries, Papacy. The sources for the conflict are written in 9 different languages and are scattered across the archives of every Western European country. War creates states, and states create nations. That has been the pattern of European history from the late Middle Ages until the end of the 19th century. In late medieval England and France, the state loomed larger in these years than it had at any earlier stage. It imposed and collected taxes, it recruited armies and fleets, it organized the defense of coasts and frontiers. Getting public backing called for a sustained barrage of propaganda through sermons, newsletters, songs, ballads, proclamations read out at street corners, and in many other ways. A web of rumor and gossip, of grievance and joy, united, disparate, and scattered communities, and created a sense of national identity, which had previously been limited to an elite group of ministers and clergymen. Huge crowds gathered in London in 1357 and in 1415 to welcome back victorious armies. The echoes of these great wars filled the history plays of Shakespeare, and Shakespeare immortalized them for future generations. The great Duke of Marlborough, when asked what was his source for some historical observation that he had made, is said to have replied, "Shakespeare, the only history of England that I have ever read." These wars formed the institutions of both England and France in ways which influenced the whole of their subsequent history. It became part of the founding national myths of both countries. The course of the war was largely determined by the war aims of the English, who were the aggressors throughout, and by, to some extent, logistics and geography. Since the 12th century, the English kings had been dukes of Aquitaine in southwestern France. In that capacity, they had been vassals of the kings of France. Their rights as dukes of Aquitaine had been progressively eroded by the centralizing instincts of the French monarchy for half a century before the outbreak of the war. The war actually began when the French king Philip VI finally confiscated the Duchy of Aquitaine in 1337 and tried to seize it by force. Edward III's main war aim throughout was to defend Aquitaine from conquest and erosion, to recover those parts of the duchy which had been lost over the past decade, and to extend his position in western France so as to control as much as possible of the Atlantic seaboard. The Atlantic provinces would provide his armies with a land bridge between the Channel and Bordeaux. So what about the English king's claim to the throne of France? The Duke of Marlborough would have said that that was the sole issue at stake, because that is the impression that you get from Shakespeare. In 1340, Edward III had himself proclaimed King of France before an immense crowd in the Friday market of the Flemish city of Ghent. That was 3 years after the war began. But although scholars have argued about this, I do not believe that Edward III had any serious expectation of mounting the French throne. The claim was a legal and diplomatic device. It gave him legal cover for what would otherwise have been an act of rebellion against the King of France. It also it explains why he chose Ghent for this proclamation. The Flemings were his chief allies. They were subjects of the King of France. They had repudiated their count and were supplying part of Edward III's army. If Edward III was King of France, then their support for him enjoyed at least a colourable legitimacy. If not, then they were simply traitors. Diplomatically, Edward's claim to the French throne gave him a bargaining counter, but he was always willing to trade his claim to the throne in return for a sufficiently generous territorial settlement in the southwest. That tells you something about his war aim, what his war aims really were. Edward III's territorial ambitions moulded his strategy. He landed armies in Gascony, which he directly controlled, in Flanders and Brittany, whose rulers were his allies, and in Normandy, where he hoped to take advantage of a rebellion against the authority of the King of France. He mounted large, fast-moving raids from the coast into the heart of France, destroying everything in his path in the hope of bludgeoning the French kings into accepting his territorial demands. The English never had the financial resources or the supply train which were necessary to keep an army in the field for very long. They were never able to besiege an important town or city, except for Calais, and that was special. It took them 11 months, and they had direct loads of supply by sea from England. The English were able to establish garrisons on the marches of Normandy and Brittany, which survived by looting the surrounding country, but they were never able to attempt a permanent occupation of territory. It was essentially a strategy of terrorism, and in fact it achieved nothing other than to increase the determination of the other side. In 1360, Edward III was able to force a favourable treaty on the French king, John II, which briefly achieved most of his territorial ambitions. That was only possible because John II, King of France, had been captured by the Black Prince at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356 and was willing to concede almost anything to recover his freedom. Edward's triumph was short-lived because the strategic weakness of England had not gone away. Within a decade and a half, John II's successor, Charles V, had recovered everything that his father had ceded in 1360. That was what the 14th century wars were like. The character of the 15th century wars was completely different. In the first place, the policy of terrorist raids on the French countryside was abandoned. The Agincourt campaign of 1415 was the last of the great armed raids which had characterized the strategy of the Third. Agincourt shattered the morale and the political prestige of the French monarchy, but strategically it achieved almost nothing, just as Edward III's raids had achieved almost nothing. Henry V, therefore, changed his methods. Between 1417 and 1420, he conquered Normandy and a number of neighbouring provinces. He then embarked upon a permanent and enormously expensive military occupation with an organised administration in Rouen, based on some 4 dozen permanent garrisons spread across the western provinces of France. That was the first difference between the 15th century wars and the 14th century wars. The second was that in the 15th century, the old claim to the throne of France became for the first time a serious prospect. In September 1419, the Dauphin and his advisors, who were ruling France in the name of King Charles VI, murdered the king's most powerful and dangerous subject, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. This event threw the House of Burgundy into the arms of the English. The Burgundians responded by acknowledging Henry V as Charles VI's heir and future King of France at the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. They then assisted the English to occupy Paris and conquer most of France north of the Loire. The Valois dynasty was only saved because a particularly brilliant generation of administrators succeeded in creating a rival government south of the Loire with exact replicas of the state institutions of Paris with its 2 capitals in Poitiers and Bourges. Once that had happened, there was frankly no chance that central and southern France would fall into Henry V's hands, or would enable him to become the effective ruler of the whole country, as the Treaty of Troyes had envisaged. The premature death of Henry V in 1422 left his legacy in the hands of his infant heir, Henry VI, and his brother, John, Duke of Bedford. Over the next 30 years, Henry V's remarkable achievement gradually unraveled as a result of a shortage of money and manpower, the personal inadequacies of his successor, and acrimonious divisions within the governing elite in England. The actual experience of war was very different in England and France. Enemy armies did not trample across England, leaving death and destruction in their wake. The Scottish raids into England never penetrated south of Durham. The French and Castilian coastal raids severely damaged Southampton in 1338, Rye in 1377, Plymouth in 1403, and Sandwich in 1457. But none of them penetrated inland, and all of them were ultimately repelled by local levies in a matter of days. As far as the rest of England was concerned, they saw nothing of the war. There was in fact only one point at which England was at serious risk of invasion, and that was in 1386, when French armies massing by the coast of Flanders provoked panic across England. In spite of the immense resources poured into that project by the French government, it failed because the logistical problems of carrying a large army across the sea and landing it on a hostile coast proved to be too great. The English found it much easier to invade France across the sea, and this basic asymmetry arose because of between the position of strategic position of England and France explains why the war was fought almost entirely on French soil. Why was it easier for the English to invade France by sea than the other way around. One reason was that late medieval England was far more dependent on seaborne trade than France was, and that meant that it had a much larger merchant marine. That mattered at a time when warships and war transports were almost all converted merchantmen. Another reason was that for most of the wars, the English had secure bases on the continent where their armies could land without opposition on the beaches. Bordeaux was in English hands throughout the wars, and Calais was in English hands after the first 10 years. Brest and Cherbourg were in their hands in the late 14th century, and Normandy was in their hands for much of the last 30 years of the war. Flanders was an English ally for most of the 14th century and much of the 15th. Indeed, for much of the 15th century, the French had controlled no part of the Atlantic coast at all, except for an area around La Rochelle, their only significant port. The result of this asymmetry was that the war was a much more bitter and direct experience for the French than it was for the English. The fate of townspeople slaughtered in the streets of a ville prise, or defeated infantry and camp followers cut down by horsemen in thousands as they fled from an unsuccessful battle, the fate of peasants or merchants killed or kidnapped by freelance brigades in open country. These things touched even a world inured to violence. One pamphleteer reckoned that more than 2 million French lives had been lost in the wars, not to speak of those who had suffered from abduction, rape, and arson. The English left France scarred by 4 decades of war, which followed Henry V's invasion of Normandy in 1417. The strength of armies, when one looks at the records, seems quite small. There were never more than 15,000 English soldiers at any one time on the English payroll in France. The armies of the kings of France, particularly Charles VII, were never more than 20,000 strong, and usually much smaller than that. But figures like these give a misleading impression of the scale of military activity. The actual strength of armies was at least twice as great when armed pages, servants, and auxiliaries who didn't appear on the payroll were included. In addition, there were important garrisons and freelance companies in contested territory who lived on the population around them and did not appear on payroll either. The impact of all these disparate forces was magnified by the general breakdown of public order which followed the passage of the armies as local men took up arms or were driven by poverty and unemployment to banditry or swelling the numbers of companies of freelance brigands. Every traveller who passed through northern France remarked on the scale of the visible war damage. Jean de Boy, whose autobiographical novel Le Jouvencel is one of the great literary records of a soldier's life in the late Middle Ages, described riding through country wrecked by war, a land desolate and abandoned, the inhabitants few and poor, peasant houses that looked like the lairs of wild animals, and the occasional gentleman living in a modest castle or a fortified manor with ancient crumbling walls and freezing halls. Thomas Bassin, who eventually became a bishop and successively counsellor to English and French monarchs, travelled through France as a student in the 1420s. He has left us a famous description of northern France as a sea of brambles in which abandoned cattle are the only sign of life. It's often dismissed as hyperbole, but it was certainly true of the worst affected regions of France: Picardy, Beauvaisis, the Ile-de-France, northern and western Champagne, and the marches of Normandy. Sir John Fortescue, the Lancastrian Chief Justice, who lived in exile in France in the 1460s, travelled through the same regions and remarked on the ill-dressed, undernourished peasants and barren grounds that he saw everywhere. Verily, he wrote, They live in the most extreme poverty and misery, and yet dwell and lay in the most fertile realm of the world. It wasn't just physical violence which destroyed these regions and their communities, but the depopulation which followed and made recovery so difficult. The French royal councillor, Jean Juvenal des Ursins, was exaggerating when he told the Estates General of France in 1433 that France had lost 9/10 of its population. Only in a small number of very heavily damaged regions did the depopulation even approach that level. But he did put his finger on the deadly combination of famine and disease which lay behind France's demographic catastrophe in the 15th century. The pamphleteer's figure of 2 million deaths, which I've already quoted, was a guess. The Middle Ages wasn't good at statistics, but it was a plausible guess if one includes the indirect casualties as well as the direct ones. War provoked famine by destroying crops and barns, looting draft animals, uprooting vines and trees. These were major capital assets whose the effect of their destruction would have been felt for a generation after it had happened. War stopped the movement of grain and other foodstuffs. It increased mortality, especially among children, through poverty, exposure, malnutrition, and the transmission of disease. Above all, the war provoked large-scale migration away from the war zones. Initially, the crowds of displaced country people fled to nearby castles and walled towns, which offered them a temporary refuge. But towns and villages had limited shelter to offer and no subsistence or employment for strangers. People returned to their homes when the danger had passed, but every time it was in smaller numbers. The landscape gradually changed as the countryside emptied out. The suburbs of walled towns were demolished to deprive an enemy of cover. Outlying farmsteads in the country were abandoned in favour of village houses that clustered together for safety. Eventually, families gave up, abandoned the land and just moved away. Scrub and forest took over the arable land. The forests came with the English, was a well-known saying at the time. England's experience of the war was very different. Another pamphleteer, writing in about 1420, wrote that if the whole of England were put up for sale, it would not fetch 100th part of the damage that the English had done to France. Another difference was reflected in the built landscape. There was no equivalent in England of the dense network of garrisoned castles that you would have found in Normandy, in Ile-de-France, or the marches of Gascony. A French herald, who had probably visited England, claimed in the 1450s that the country's characteristic noble residence was an undefended manor house, not a castle, and that for every proper castle in England, there were at least 50 in France. Now, his figures may have been suspect, but his impression was broadly right. At least half of the 1,500 or so castles recorded as having been built in England since the Norman Conquest had been abandoned by 1300 and allowed to fall into ruin. They were not replaced. Many of the rest were no longer surveyed or maintained in defensible condition. No one troubled to repair them at the outset of the war with France. Very few new castles were built for defence in the 14th century, and none in the 15th. The many fine castles put up in the 15th century were designed for status, comfort, and display. They had thin walls, large windows, and no provision for a garrison. Their crenellations and gatehouses were more decorative than functional. Fewer than half of English towns important enough to have royal charters were walled, and many of the rest had walls built for prestige rather than defence. The Czech traveller Leo van Rosmetaal, who toured Europe in the 1460s, was surprised when he visited England to find that even important places like Salisbury and Poole were unwalled. The impact of the war on England was mainly economic. taxation hit levels which were historically high. Great quantities of silver left England in the pockets of the troops to be spent or lost in France. Productive resources were diverted on a large scale into fighting. At any one time, between 5,000 and 40,000 soldiers, including pages, varlets and hangers-on, were serving in France. To carry them to France, ships were requisitioned and large numbers of seamen were press-ganged to man them at very considerable cost to England's overseas trade. Measured against a total population of between 2 and 2.5 million, of whom perhaps a third were able-bodied adult males, the war is calculated to have consumed up to 1/10 of the available manpower at times of peak demand. That is a proportion roughly comparable to the proportion conscripted in the Second World War. At a time of labour shortage and high wages, that represented a very substantial economic burden. The fact that recruitment was often concentrated in a limited geographical area associated with some great captain must have created pockets of severe economic depression. The most significant cost of the war to England was probably due to the disruption of its export trades. England was dependent on exports, mainly of wool and cloth, to a degree completely unmatched in Europe, except by the Low Countries. The English government tightly regulated the wool trade throughout the war. It did that partly in order to use it as a diplomatic weapon against Flanders and the principalities of the Low Countries, and partly to generate monopoly profits from a commodity which was essential to the textile industries of Italy and Northern Europe. Edward III effectively nationalized the trade between 1337 and 1342 and used it to fund his early campaigns in France. From 1343 onwards, the English government operated a staple system under which wool exports were compulsorily channeled through a designated staple port, usually Calais, and a privileged cartel of staple merchants. The controlled wool market and the mint of Calais were a very important element in English war finance until well into the 16th century. The main victims of this system were, of course, the industrial consumers of continental Europe, but it must also have depressed the prices paid to growers. Ultimately, it contributed to the slow demise of the trade as wool was diverted to feed the indigenous textile industry, which was more lightly taxed and regulated. The trade wars, which affected both raw wool and finished cloth, added to the economic burden experienced by England. Valois France was closed to direct English exports for the best part of 120 years. Castile, an important market for English cloth, was closed to exports during the 1370s and 80s, when England was at war with the Trastamara kings of Castile, and then again in the reign of Henry V, when Castile boycotted English goods in support of its French ally. The breach with the House of Burgundy in 1435 resulted in a ban on trade with England throughout the Burgundian Low Countries until 1440, and another between 1447 and 1452. Although the ban was widely evaded, it had a very serious impact on cloth exports to Flanders, Holland and Brabant. Trade with the Baltic, another major market, was badly disrupted in these years, since much of it was conducted through the great entrepôts of Middelburg, Bergen and Antwerp. Even allies and neutrals periodically broke off commercial relations in reprisal for English naval operations, which frequently degenerated into piracy. Trade with the Hanstons was suspended for that reason from 1447 until well into the 1470s. Now, many Frenchmen believed that the English had extracted immeasurable riches from France. To the chronicler Thomas Bassin, who was Bishop of Lisieux in Normandy, it seemed perfectly obvious that England's prosperity was the mirror image of France's ruin. The English certainly did loot France. They received grants of land in Normandy, which had been confiscated from their previous French owners. They levied protection money from districts within the reach of their castles. They plundered captured towns. They took valuable prisoners, from whom they exacted large ransoms. Some English captains made fortunes which they brought back to England and spent on conspicuous consumption, or invested usually in land and buildings. Their expenditure brought money into the English economy, indirectly benefiting many who had never set foot in France. Henry of Grosmont, Earl of Derby, was reported to have paid for the entire cost of building the Savoy Palace on the Strand, the grandest house in London, from the ransoms of the Battle of Oberroche in 1345. Thomas Walsingham thought that the loot of Calais later that year could be found in every well-to-do home in England. And these stories naturally tended to grow in the telling. But the great mounted raids of the 14th century undoubtedly offered ideal conditions for gains of this sort. The English were on the offensive throughout. Their tactical and technical superiority on the battlefield was at its height. When the antiquary John Leland toured England in the 1530s, the wars were still a powerful memory. People pointed out to him great castles and palaces said to have been built with the spoils of France. In some cases, this was a fable fondly repeated by credulous proprietors. But it is clear that there was a boom in the construction of grand aristocratic houses by successful soldiers who had made money in France. Yet these visible signs of wealth were deceptive, because the striking thing about the stately residences of successful English soldiers is that they were almost all built on fortunes made before 1425. Conditions were much more difficult later. English captains did not rush home with their spoils like the victors of Agincourt or their 14th century forebears. They were based in France, where they were engaged in a permanent military occupation. Occupation brought fewer occasions for profit and very large costs, and the profits, such as they were, tended to be retained in France and brought little benefit to England. After 1424, there were few pitched battles, and the English lost most of them. From 1429, they were generally on the defensive. The last 3 decades of the English presence in France were wretched years for English arms. Few men brought wealth home in those conditions. It has been estimated that the nominal value of the English nobility's land holdings in Normandy in the 1420s was about a sixth of the entire value of their English holdings, but all that was lost in the final collapse. On the whole, it is most unlikely that England was better off for having fought a long, costly, and ultimately unsuccessful war with France. In reality, however, this kind of profit and loss account is meaningful only in an age like ours, in which material welfare is the proper concern of the state. For us, resources spent on avoidable wars are by definition diverted from more worthwhile alternatives. In the Middle Ages, pity and charity were certainly Christian duties, but material welfare, in a broader sense, was not the collective concern of human societies that it later became. And that explains much that seems strange about the attitude of medieval men to war. War, as they saw it, was not a catastrophic exception to the orderly course of life. It was a natural feature of human affairs. At the end of the 14th century, the civil lawyer Honoré Bohe, whose work was widely read by heralds and soldiers, condemned the view of people he called simple fellows who thought that war was necessarily an evil. Antipathies, rivalries, conflicts were unavoidable, he argued, and war was a natural and inevitable mode of dispute resolution between sovereigns who acknowledged no superior below God. It was, said Bohe, good and virtuous, for war by its very nature, he said, seeks nothing other than to set wrongs right and to turn discord into peace in accordance with the scripture. Now, in many ways, the war determined the lines on which both England and France would develop over the following centuries. To defeat the English, the French kings were obliged to adopt an extremely authoritarian mode of government. They never succeeded in creating representative institutions like the English Parliament with the power to authorize taxation and to bargain for it. In order to survive, the French kings were forced to levy taxes by royal decree without even the semblance of consent. The principle of permanent taxation, imposed and varied by royal ordinance, was far too valuable to the kings of France to be abandoned when the war had ended. I am privileged to levy what I like from my subjects, is what Philippe de Commines remembered Louis XI saying. Now, these developments brought an immense and permanent accretion of power to the French monarchy after the wars were over. Charles VII's revenues in the last years of the war were about 4 times those of the King of England in a good year. They enabled him to maintain a standing army of 8,000 men, in addition to a permanent reserve of another 8,000 infantry. Now, Louis XI doubled both of those numbers. For the first time, the King of France had a crushing preponderance of armed force within his own realm. Only the largest coalitions of French princes could now hope to challenge him by force, and then only with the assistance of external powers. As a result, France emerged from the wars with a large and permanent military establishment, which committed the country to a system of permanent taxation of indefinite duration. The kings were constrained only by their conscience and by the diminishing risk of rebellion. Writing in France under Louis XI, Sir John Fortescue thought that the difference between taxation by consent and by royal ordinance was fundamental. It marked, he said, the difference between unfettered royal power exercised by the kings of France and the more limited political monarchy in England. France too, he said, had once been a political monarchy before the wars with England, when the Estates General had performed a function roughly comparable to the English Parliament. But those days were over. If the kings of England had been able to govern with a power entirely regal, as he called it, they too would have been able to change the laws and tax their subjects at will, as the kings of France did. This is the sort of government to which the civil laws refer, he wrote, when they say that what the prince pleases the prince is law. Fortescue did not welcome that kind of government, and most of his compatriots in England shared his view. Those differences accounted in large part for the different political destinies of England and France in the following centuries. The roots of the absolute monarchy of 17th and 18th century France lay in the methods needed to defeat the English in the 15th century. In England, the king's need for money to fund their wars in France had diametrically the opposite effect. The war in England reinforced the role of Parliament and the king's dependence on it. Even the Tudors, with their strong authoritarian instincts, were unable to reverse the central role which Parliament had acquired during the wars with France. With control of the purse came, of course, political authority. The role of the English Parliament intensified political activity in the communities represented there, the gentry of the shires, the royal officials, clans and councillors of the nobility, and the oligarchies of the towns. It dispersed political power among a relatively large and coherent political community, forcing a more consensual style of government on the English crown. Now, the price which the English kings paid for this advantage was a severe constraint on their foreign policy. After the wars with England were over, France returned to the career of conquest in Italy and Germany, which had characterized our history before the wars had begun. France was the first major European power to establish a standing army funded by permanent taxation and to deploy it in support of foreign conquests. The 16th century was to be the first great age of European standing armies. England was unique among the major European powers, being without a standing army until the time of Oliver Cromwell, and even Cromwell's army was much smaller than the immense hosts deployed by the continental powers. Standing forces and direct taxation enabled the major European states to conduct a persistently aggressive foreign policy. This was not an option open to England. The principalities of fragmented Italy, Germany, and the Rhineland, which could not deploy resources on the same scale, became the prizes for which these powers contended with ever larger and more expensive professional armies. England might have been another of those prizes if events had turned out differently. The Spanish Armada of 1588 was the gravest external threat that England had faced since the abortive French invasion project of 1386. Spain deployed some 30,000 professional soldiers against England, far more than the French had done 2 centuries before. Leaving aside the inexperienced volunteers of the trade bands, England had fewer than 6,000 professional soldiers available to confront them in 1588. That was roughly the same number as they had had in 1386. The crippling cost of warfare would ultimately bankrupt France, Spain, and all the other leading states of Europe. And in France, it would ultimately provoke a revolution. The English kings stood aside from this movement, not by choice, not from wisdom, but because of the difficulty of raising taxes on the scale that had become normal in much of continental Europe. It wasn't until the reigns of William III and Queen Anne at the beginning of the 18th century that England, aided by a growing maritime empire and a rapidly expanding economy, plus an exponential increase in the tax take, once again played the decisive role in European politics that it had previously played in the time of Edward III and Henry V. When the last remnants of Sir John Talbot's army sailed for England from Bordeaux in October 1453, at the end of the 100 Years' War, it was far from clear to contemporaries that this era of English aggression was past. It wasn't until the 19th century, when the 100 Years' War was coined as a phrase by the French historian Jules Michelet, it wasn't until then that people began to perceive the essential unity of the period which began with the French forfeiture of Guyenne in 1337 and ended with the final expulsion of the English from the Duchy of Aquitaine in 1453. Michelet's phrase was, of course, born of hindsight, yet it expressed the truth that later wars between England and France were fundamentally different. Before 1453, England's insular identity had been a literary conceit. Politically, England had not been an island when Edward III came to the throne in 1327. It had been the heart of a European polity that embraced significant parts of Western France. But for those facts, the English kings would have had no reason to involve themselves in the continental war with France, and would have had no interest in fighting them. It was the expulsion of the Plantagenet kings from their continental possessions at the end of the 100 Years' War that made England a political island for the first time since the Norman conquest 4 centuries before. Defeat proved to be as decisive for the future of England as victory was for that of France. What would have happened if Henry V and the Duke of Bedford had achieved their ambition of uniting England and France under the House of Lancaster? England would then, of necessity, have remained a continental power, but in a rather particular sense. It would have become part of a continental power whose centre of gravity would inevitably have moved eastward towards its richer and more populous French territory. The resulting tensions would have become intolerable, and an English war of independence would ultimately have followed. As it was, the outcome vindicated the prediction of Charles VII's councillor Jean-Juvenal des Ursins. What he wrote was this: France will be France, and England will be England, separate and incompatible countries, in the nature of things too immense to be
contribution of the mercenary free companies under Peter Gesslin. Were they actually important?
Well, Gesselin was different. He was the Constable of France, and his companies, although they did contain mercenaries, were fighting very much in the interests of the French king. So it's not really true to describe them as mercenaries, but of course there were many mercenary companies. They were important in the sense that they added very significantly to the destruction suffered by France. But they were not under the control of either side for most of the period. There were exceptions to that. Richard II, in the last 30 years of the 14th century, his ministers undoubtedly did use mercenary companies as surrogate armies instead of the armies that they had to pay themselves. The mercenaries, of course, didn't need to be paid because they lived en route. There were other relatively short periods when mercenary companies were made a strategic difference to the course of the war, but they were relatively brief.
Well, Sumption, all historians spring from their own period, and it's now more than 25 years since you published your volume 2. And I wonder how your thinking has been shaped by intervening events since then, because two events seem to me to have happened. One is your what you finished with, which was your reference to what would have been likely to have happened if the British had in fact united with France, because we've had Brexit. And the second is that the Black Death, in volume 2, you say that the Estates General had voted money for Philip VI to invade England, and the Black Death stopped him doing that in 1348 when he had plans. And I wonder how your thinking of it has been shaped by our own pandemic experience over the same period.
The answer is not at all.
You didn't mention the Black Death this evening.
No. The Black Death actually made very little difference. That was partly, probably mainly, because the Black Death, one talks about the Black Death, people normally mean the great outbreak of between 1348 and 1350. There were, of course, a number of outbreaks. Bubonic plague became endemic, and it resurfaced as epidemics roughly every 25 years. There were different strains which attacked different groups differently. The Great Black Death, 1348 to 50, for reasons which are not really understood, primarily attacked the old, children, and to some extent, to a greater extent, women than men, so that the casualty rate among males of military age was much smaller than the casualty rate of about a third in the country at large. The outbreaks in the early 1370s and at the end of the 14th century were less serious overall, but probably more serious as they affected the military classes. But they tended to happen at times of relative peace intervals in the course of the war. So I don't think that Black Death or its successors made a great deal of difference. As to Brexit, well, I would have written exactly the same before Brexit happened. And indeed, it's worth remembering that every volume of my 5-volume book, except the last, was written before either of the two catastrophes that you mentioned had occurred.
I think one of the most interesting things you gave us in a very interesting talk was how the course of the Hundred Years' War affected the two nations, France and England, subsequently. And it's very thought-provoking for me, as someone who's lived in France, a Francophile, and indeed as an Englishman. But what intrigues me is why did that difference develop, the centralisation of power to the French king and the retention in England of, let us just call it some sort of parliamentary that happen? Was it a cultural difference, or was there some other fundamental cause?
Well, I think the main difference, main reason for the difference, the main reason for the lesser importance of representative assemblies in France is that the French state never succeeded in establishing the principle that the decision of the Estates General bound the whole of France. So in practice, what happened is the Estates General would agree to the levying of a tax. The provinces would then unanimously declare that they didn't agree and weren't bound by that. So there was then a painful process of negotiation to get them to agree province by province. And the result of that was that concessions had to be made. Usually they had the effect of reducing the yield. Quite often they had the effect of restricting the expenditure of, say, the province of Rouen to the defense of Rouen, which wasn't frankly much use to the king in Paris. The absence of a binding process of consent was the real reason why it was never possible for France to produce the equivalent of the English Parliament. I think that's partly explained by the fact that France, although it was relatively centralized by European standards, was not as centralized as England and was a much more varied country. France had many languages, many legal systems, and it was not a homogeneous country, whereas in most respects England was, and that created a sense of national decision making much earlier in England than it did in France. By the end of the 100 Years' War, these habits were ingrained, and although it might have been possible to create the equivalent of the English Parliament, it was unrealistic to expect it to happen. Governments and constitutions are very conservative things.
Your final sentence in your final volume referred to Charles VII's advisor saying that France and England were separate and individual.
What I quoted at the end of
Yes.
my talk this evening.
And yet in 1940, the wartime coalition suggested that the war cabinet be joined with that of France, and that Frenchmen and Englishmen were interchangeable, should have joint citizenship almost. Have we, in those centuries, had no sense of France's identity as a nation, a separate nation, and its history? Is it something that we simply don't recall because we haven't been taught it, or is it that we simply haven't got the imagination, or as we would say today, emotional intelligence to appreciate the very importance of French history?
I think that Englishmen have always regarded France as different, and vice versa. The implications of that obviously have differed over time, depending on whether we were allies or adversaries. England and France have been adversaries much more often than they have been friends, although obviously the position since the beginning of the 20th century has become much more cheerful. There are, of course, two opinions, at least two opinions, on how realistic Churchill's offer was. An exiled government of France joined with an English government which was very much an effective belligerent. It would have been an extremely unequal partnership. Its object was to bring the French resources, principally their colonies and their fleet, under English control. So that I think that it may not have been quite as magnanimous a gesture as history records.
You didn't mention religion. Did religion play any part at all in the 100 Years' War?
I don't think so. Religion sought to civilize warfare by imposing rules about non-combatants, for example, that nobody paid any attention to them. I mean, the most striking evidence of that possibly the work of Honoré Beauvais, which I mentioned in my talk. Honoré Beauvais was a Celestine monk. He was, by all accounts, a holy man, but he also said, the truth is that war is the collapse of all the civilized values which religion seeks to teach. Therefore, many things which are perfectly acceptable in warfare, then the only way of resolving international disputes, have become normal. In one of his chapters, he considers whether it's legitimate to destroy civilian property in the course of war, just for the sake of it. And his conclusion was yes, because it was very much the sort of what one might call the Bomber Harris doctrine, that civilian societies create the resources which make war possible, and are therefore a perfectly legitimate target. I think that Honoré Beauvais would have been surprised by some of the provisions of the 1949 Geneva Convention.
Was the possession of the longbow a major factor in keeping the British coming back and fighting battles? Because without the longbow, they might well have struggled.
It depends which period one's talking about. The longbow dominated the battlefields of France throughout the 14th century, because only the English and the Scots actually used longbows. Scottish longbows tended to be shorter, and their range was less. But things change in the 15th century. They changed for a number of technical reasons. One was the much greater effectiveness of 15th century crossbows. 14th century crossbows had a bow which was made of laminated strips of wood. And that created a good deal of tension. But the steel, the flexible steel crossbows which replaced them by almost universally by 1420 had a much longer range. They outranged the longbow by a very considerable amount. The longbow retains the advantage of the rate of fire, because to use a crossbow, between shots, you have to put your foot into the stirrup, pull the thing up, the wire back with a lever, and then aim it again. Whereas it was possible, it's calculated that a skilled crossbowman could shoot off 2 bolts a minute, but a skilled longbowman could loose off 30 or 40 arrows in that time. After the last battle in which the longbow really was decisive, that was the Battle of Agincourt. The subsequent battles was much less important, and that was partly because of a revival of the power of cavalry, again for technical reasons. The French were better at cavalry fighting than the English were, and they devised a number of technical improvements which enabled them to use longer lances without having to develop particularly fierce muscles. And the combination of improvement in crossbows and the revival of cavalry fighting in the 15th century undoubtedly reduced the significance of longbows. Sir John Fortescue wrote that the power of England stands by her longbowmen. He was writing in the 1460s when that was no longer true. The Mary Rose wreck shows that the fighting crews of large warships in the 16th century were still armed mainly with longbows, but that was becoming extremely archaic, and it was possibly a good thing that no major English sea battle had to be fought in the time of Henry VIII.
The Hundred Years' War was
punctuated by a large number of truces and genuine efforts, as far as I can see, to make peace, because it was in their guise. But it never happened. Why couldn't it happen?
The efforts to make peace were genuine in the sense that a lot of trouble was taken. But the problem was that the English were, after 1360, and 1360 in quite exceptional circumstances, was the English basically surrendered their claim to the throne of France in return for generous territorial settlement. That proved to be impossible for a number of reasons, for later kings. And the English were never willing to surrender their claim to the throne of France thereafter. That was because in the 15th century the claim was actually much more realistic than it had been in the 14th. It was partly also because most of these peace conferences happened at a time when the king was a minor. That's certainly true of the Bruges Conference in 1377 and the Arras Conference in 1435. The problem about the king being a minor was that nobody was prepared to make irrevocable decisions. I think that there was an element of pretense about many of these truces and conferences. People actually cared about their reputation, surprisingly enough, and they recognized that you had to at least pretend you're trying to make peace. Pretending was, I think, what a lot of these occasions were actually about.
Was there any real resistance in England socially to the expense and the burden of the war?
There was towards the end. Towards the end, there was a great deal of resistance to certainly any serious level of taxation, and sometimes to recruitment, particularly in coastal areas where people were being press gangs to serve on transports and warships. I mean, it very much depended on how the war was going. People were prepared to make sacrifices when the war was going well, as it was for most of the reign of Edward III and Henry V, both of whom became great heroes of public opinion. Public opinion did matter, and when the chain of victories was replaced by more as a uniform chain of defeats, clearly people became much less happy to contribute.
So can we draw from that that this was to some degree a national project rather than a royal project?
I think it was viewed as a national project, yes. It was certainly funded by national taxation.
There's a view that the medieval state was inherently unstable, but if you didn't get your barons fighting abroad, they'd come and have civil war. And the outbreak of the Wars of the Roses fairly shortly after the conclusion of the 100 Years' War seems to bear that out. Is that your view?
No, it's not. The great historian Kenneth Bruce MacFarlane once observed that the problem about medieval England was not the overmighty subject, but the undermighty king. And that, I think, expresses a great truth. For most of the Middle Ages, the aristocracy were natural allies, not natural opponents of the king. They represented an intermediate level of government in the counties in a society which did not have a national, straight civil service. They were the king's recruiting agents, they were the king's chief creditors, and they manned his court as well as commanding his armies. They did all of that because it was necessary to do it to justify their status and their image of themselves. when the king was incapable of managing his enormous patronage, when he was taken over by cabals on one side or another, it was much less easy to keep control. And that's what happened in the reign of Richard II, and it's what happened in the later years of Henry VI. The disappearance of the king as an effective force effectively unstrung the whole edifice. But for most of the Middle Ages, the edifice was intact. It worked.
Thank you.
I think there's an assumption among many non-specialists of the period that but for Henry V's untimely death, England would have achieved its aim of uniting the two crowns, but was that necessarily the case?
I don't think it was, because by the time Henry V died, the Dauphin, Charles VII, had succeeded, who became Charles VII, the Dauphin had succeeded in creating this shadow government of the south. And south of the Loire, the Dauphin was recognized pretty well everywhere as the effective king. It seems to me that once that had happened, it became very difficult to imagine that the English could ever have conquered the whole of France with the resources which they had. The resources of England were actually rather smaller than the 40% of France which the Dauphin controlled. And I just don't think that it would ever have been possible. It was expensive enough just to occupy militarily Normandy. To imagine reproducing that military regime across the whole of northern France, let alone southern France as well, that seems to me to be completely out of the question. I think you have to remember that medieval societies generated very small surpluses over subsistence levels for their population. The size of that surplus, which of course varies with centuries of society, is what enables wars to happen. And it was too small in the late Middle Ages to envisage a permanent military occupation at all. The English attempt to occupy Normandy was the most remarkable attempt in the whole of the Middle Ages at the military occupation of hostile territory. And ultimately, it was unsustainable even in Normandy.
So you don't think Henry V could have done what William I did to England?
No. William I, yes, he was attacking an altogether less organized and less intensively administered country than England subsequently became. No, I don't think that England could have done that.
More questions before we break?
You mentioned the Scots very briefly at the beginning, and since we're in a Caledonian club, it might be appropriate to hear. You said that they had gone as far as somewhere in the north. Could you just expand a bit more about what significance, if any, the Scots had during this period?
They had a good deal of significance. In the 14th century, the Scots timed their incursions into northern England to coincide with English attempts to invade France, a deliberate exercise of distraction. But Lord Burleigh, Queen Elizabeth's Secretary of State, once remarked that studying the history of Scottish incursions into England, it was apparent that the Scots were incapable of victualling an army for more than 2 weeks. As a result of which, they were incapable of mounting more than raids. They just didn't have the manpower or indeed the agricultural resources to do that. Much more effective was the role of Scotland in the 15th century, where largely Battle of Verneuil and the Battle of Beaugé, both in the 1420s, were both battles in which the French army was predominantly Scottish. The Douglas has brought 3 armies in the space of about 8 years to France, the largest of which was 6,000 strong. It was a large army by the standards of the time. The Scots were altogether less fazed by English military prowess than the French were. They did not suffer from the catastrophic collapse of military morale which occurred in the years after Agincourt. They were the ultimate shock troops of the kind that the Scots have actually continued to be ever since. But the trouble about mercenary armies exported from Scotland is that you have a finite pool of manpower which is inevitably suffers from attrition in the course of operations. Verneuil essentially destroyed the Scottish Army of France, fought as a separate unit, and it was completely massacred. And although the French continued to recruit small companies of Scots primarily to serve in the French king's personal bodyguard, 1424 was the last occasion when a ready formed army of Scots actually fought as a unit in France, unless you count fighting on the English side in the Napoleonic Wars and the First and Second World War.
Okay, we'll break there. Thank